In the spring of 1954, Elvis Presley paid $2 at the door of a Los Angeles jazz club and took a seat in the back row under a name that was not his own. He was 19 years old, unknown outside a small circle of Memphis musicians, and he had driven from Tennessee to California for reasons that he explained to no one, including himself. What he told the man at the door was that he was there for the music. What he did not tell anyone, what he told no one for the next 12 years until a conversation in a Las Vegas hotel room that was not supposed to be overheard, was who the music was by and what it had done to him. The musician was Chet Baker. The set Baker played that night was, by the accounts of the club's regulars, unremarkable by Baker's standards. By Elvis Presley's standards, it was the most important 90 minutes of music he had ever heard. To understand why a 19-year-old from Memphis was in Los Angeles in the spring of 1954, you have to understand what Elvis Presley was at that point, not what he would become, which was something no one in the spring of 1954 could have fully predicted, but what he actually was in the months before Sam Phillips at Sun Records put a microphone in front of him and changed the shape of American popular music. He was a truck driver who sang. He had been singing in church since he was old enough to stand, had absorbed the gospel music of the Pentecostal congregations he grew up in, with the specific depth of someone for whom the music was not entertainment but something prior to that, something that organized the world into a shape that made sense in a way the world without music did not. He had been listening to rhythm and blues on Memphis radio since his early teens, absorbing it with the same depth, letting it sit alongside the gospel in whatever interior space he had developed for music that mattered. What he had not been exposed to, in any sustained way, was jazz. Memphis in the early 1950s was not a jazz city in the way that New York or Los Angeles was a jazz city. The music existed there, but not as the dominant cultural force that rhythm and blues and gospel represented for the communities Elvis had grown up in. Jazz was something that lived in the periphery of Elvis's musical awareness, referenced occasionally in the radio programming he consumed but never fully present as a language he had learned to inhabit. The Los Angeles trip was not planned with a jazz club in mind. Elvis had come west for a combination of reasons: a vague sense that California represented opportunities that Memphis did not, the specific restlessness of a young man whose interior life had outgrown the container his external circumstances provided. He was staying at a motel on Sunset Boulevard, spending his days driving through the city and his evenings in a state of purposeful aimlessness, going where the evening suggested rather than where any prior intention directed. The Club Alabama on South Central Avenue was suggested by a musician Elvis had met at a diner on his second day in the city, a black piano player in his 30s named Raymond Cole, who had heard Elvis singing to himself at the counter and had struck up a conversation that lasted 2 hours and covered most of the terrain of American popular music that either of them had encountered. Cole had been playing in Los Angeles clubs for 8 years and had the specific comprehensive knowledge of the city's music scene that long residency in a musical city produces. He knew the venues, the musicians, the nights when something worth hearing was likely to happen. He had asked Elvis what kind of music he played. Elvis had said he didn't know exactly. Cole had looked at him for a moment with the assessment of a working musician evaluating an honest answer, and had said, "Then you should hear some things you don't know yet." The Club Alabama was one of his recommendations. He said a trumpet player named Baker was playing that week who was doing something with a ballad that Cole had been trying to understand for 2 years without success. Elvis had written down the name and the address on a paper napkin. He had gone the following evening without particular expectations, paid his $2, and taken the seat that would put him, without his knowing it, in the same room as one of the most significant musical encounters of his life. Chet Baker was 24 years old in the spring of 1954 and was playing at the Alabama as part of a run of West Coast engagements that followed the recording of what would become Chet Baker Sings. He was not yet nationally known in the way he would become after Capitol released the album. The name meant something in jazz circles and nothing outside them, which meant that a 19-year-old from Memphis who had no particular relationship to jazz circles would have arrived at the Alabama with no frame of reference for what he was about to hear. Baker walked onto the stage with the unhurried economy of movement that characterized everything he did, raised the trumpet, and began to play. And then, 15 minutes into the first set, He set the trumpet down and sang. What Elvis Presley heard in the next 30 seconds was something that had no precedent in his musical experience. Not because the voice was technically superior to voices he had heard. Elvis had been hearing extraordinary voices in church for his entire conscious life. But because the quality of the voice was different in kind from anything in his existing experience. Gospel voices projected. They reached outward, aimed at the congregation, aimed at God, aimed at the emotional mobilization of the room. Baker's voice did the opposite. It turned inward. It reached toward something interior and private and pulled the listener into that interior space rather than projecting outward into theirs. The effect on a room full of people who had been conditioned to receive music as something that came toward them was to produce exactly the quality that the Alabama's regulars had become accustomed to, the specific silence of people who have suddenly found themselves somewhere they did not expect to be. Elvis sat in the back row and did not move for the remaining 75 minutes of the set. Charlie Hodge, his guitarist and one of the closest members of his inner circle, said in the interview he gave in 1987 that Elvis had described the experience in the Las Vegas corridor conversation with a specificity that suggested he had replayed it many times in the intervening 12 years. Elvis said he had not understood at the time why the music affected him the way it did. He said he had spent the following months trying to figure it out. He said he had concluded, eventually, that Baker was doing something with space that he had never heard anyone do with sound. That the silences in Baker's singing contained as much as the notes, possibly more, and that this relationship between sound and silence was the thing that his gospel and rhythm and blues training had never taught him to manage, because both of those traditions were built on the principle of filling rather than leaving. The morning after the concert, Elvis went to a record store on Sunset Boulevard and bought 3 Chet Baker albums. He paid cash, gave a false name, and asked the clerk not to mention he had been there, a request that the clerk found peculiar coming from a young man nobody had yet heard of, and that he remembered for the rest of his life precisely because of what the young man's face looked like when he made it. The face was the face that would appear on a Sun Records press release 4 months later, and on every magazine cover in America within 2 years. In the spring of 1954, it was simply the face of a 19-year-old who had just heard something that required him to be anonymous about having heard it, for reasons he could not have explained clearly. Elvis drove back to Memphis with the 3 albums in the back seat and spent the following weeks listening to them in the way that he had listened to everything that mattered to him since childhood, not casually, not as background, but with the total absorption of someone receiving something important. He played the albums repeatedly in his room at the house on Alabama Avenue with the door closed, at a volume that allowed him to hear the space between Baker's notes as clearly as the notes themselves. What he was absorbing was not a technique he could apply directly. The specific qualities of Baker's voice, the tone, the phrasing, the temporal relationship to the accompaniment, were not transferable to the kind of music Elvis was developing. They belonged to a sensibility that was different in its fundamental orientation from what Elvis was building toward. Baker's music turned inward. Elvis's music, as it would develop, turned outward with an intensity that Baker's never had. The sounds they would produce were not similar. What Elvis absorbed was something beneath the sound. The understanding that silence was as available as sound, that a note not played or a syllable delayed could carry as much weight as the most powerful phrase in the register. This understanding would surface in Elvis's recordings in ways that were not obviously traceable to Chet Baker, in the specific pauses before certain phrases, in the deliberate understatement of moments that a lesser performer would have oversold, in the quality of restraint that made his best early recordings feel larger than they were because of what they chose not to do. Sam Phillips at Sun Records heard this quality when Elvis finally recorded That's All Right in July 1954, 4 months after the Los Angeles trip. Phillips said, in terms that he would spend the rest of his career trying to clarify, that Elvis had something in his phrasing that was unlike anything Phillips had encountered in the rhythm and blues artists he had recorded, a quality of knowing when not to fill the space. Phillips attributed this to Elvis's gospel background, which was the obvious and partially correct explanation. He did not know about the 3 Chet Baker albums in the back seat of the car that had returned from California in the spring. The 12 years between the Club Alabama concert and the Las Vegas corridor conversation represented the period during which Elvis's knowledge of what he had heard existed entirely in private, known only to him, informing his work in ways that were invisible because the connection between cause and effect was not legible to anyone who did not know the cause. He did not talk about Baker publicly, did not include him in the interviews where he acknowledged his musical influences, did not create any public record of the $2 paid at the door of the Alabama on a Tuesday evening in the spring of 1954. Charlie Hodge wrote down what he heard in the corridor and said nothing about it for 20 years, until the interviews he gave after Elvis's death in 1977. By that point, Chet Baker was alive but barely. The Italian imprisonment, the San Francisco beating, the years of European exile had produced the specific physical diminishment that his late photographs record. He gave no interviews about Elvis. He had nothing to say because he had nothing to know. He had no knowledge of the young man in the back row of the Alabama who had paid $2 and taken a seat and spent 90 minutes hearing something that he would spend the next 12 years unable to fully account for. The 11 Chet Baker albums found in Elvis's collection at Graceland after his death were cataloged and stored with the rest of the collection. The handwritten notes in the liner notes, single words, question marks, one date, were photographed and archived. They have been reproduced in several Baker biographies and in one extended essay about the invisible connections between American popular music's most significant figures. No one has produced a definitive account of what they mean. They are simply there, the evidence of a listening that happened in private, between a 19-year-old from Memphis and a voice coming through a speaker in a room in Tennessee, a voice that had first been heard live in the back row of a Los Angeles jazz club on a Tuesday evening in the spring of 1954. The biographers who noticed the Baker albums at Graceland found themselves in the position of people who have discovered a connection they cannot fully document. The albums were there. The date was there, in Elvis's handwriting, 4 months before Baker's Capitol Records debut. The notes in the margins were there. One beside a Baker vocal take on the third album read, simply, "This." No explanation, no context. Just the word, underlined once, pointing at something in the music that Elvis had heard and had needed to mark and had not needed to explain because the explanation was the listening itself. Charlie Hodge gave his first public account of the Las Vegas corridor conversation in a 1987 interview. He said Elvis had described what he heard at the Alabama as the first time he understood that restraint was a form of power, that you could reach an audience not by going toward them with everything you had, but by going inward and letting them follow, that the space between the notes was as available to a singer as the notes themselves, and that most singers, including Elvis himself for most of his early career, were using only half the available material. Hodge said, "He told me Baker showed him something that night that took him years to figure out how to use. He said he didn't use it the way Baker used it. Baker went inward and stayed there, and Elvis went inward and then came back out. But the going inward," he said, "he learned from Baker. He learned it from $2 at the door of a club in Los Angeles in 1954, sitting in the back row under a name that wasn't his, hoping nobody would notice." Chet Baker died in Amsterdam in 1988. Elvis had been dead for 11 years. They never met, never spoke, never knew about each other in any documented form. What passed between them passed through a recording and through a room, and through the back seat of a car driving east on a spring morning, and it left a trace only in the archived inventory of a dead man's record collection, and in the handwriting in the margins of 11 albums that most people would have said had nothing to do with each other. If the story of what Elvis Presley heard in that Los Angeles jazz club in 1954 and what he did with it in private for the next 12 years stayed with you, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who understands that the most important influences are the ones that leave no public record, that the connections between great artists are often invisible until someone thinks to look at what a dead man kept in his record collection. Have you ever heard something that changed your relationship to your own work without being able to explain why? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to explore more stories about the invisible architecture of influence that connects the musicians who changed what we hear.